Good afternoon, everyone. In time of war, a fleet can only operate efficiently if its base is defended in such a way as to provide security and thus confidence and rest. These images are from the coast defence of South Africa in 1943, but apart from the presence of female artillery personnel, these were exactly the same sorts of installations that were used to defend the Firth of Forth through half a century. The memory is fading quite rapidly that the Firth of Forth was once filled with the ships of the British Grand Fleet and was at one time the most important naval base in the British Empire. And so it was under the guns of Inchkeith that the German High Seas Fleet surrendered in November 1918. These are the 50 destroyers coming in at the rear of the great caravan of surrendered ships. During both the First and Second World Wars, the Forth was the site of the only relatively bomb-free Royal Dockyard and the place from which strong naval forces could challenge the German Navy in the North Sea. Ron Morris and I have been working in recent years to investigate the remains of the defences of the Forth on the ground and in the archives. The archives are a treasure trove not only of written information, but also dozens of detailed Royal Engineer drawings of the battery sites, some of them from the period before the First World War, works of art in their own right. For most of the batteries, what was called the Fort Record Book survives, incorporating a wide range of information about the history and operation of the batteries. And the papers of the Committee of Imperial Defence, the War Office and the Admiralty provide the wider context. From the First World War onwards, aerial photography also provides unique insights into the development of the batteries. Our lavishly illustrated account of the defences will, we hope, be published soon. In it we describe not only what was built and what survives, but also the strategic and tactical context in which the defences were built and used. It's not possible to list everyone who has helped us with our work, but we wish to acknowledge here gratefully a British Academy Leverhulme research grant. Today we can provide only a glimpse of our research and maybe dismiss a myth or two. Despite recognition that the Forth was an important commercial port, it was not until 1879 that the government finally defended the river. Gun batteries were built on Inchkeith and at Kinghorn, and these, with different guns, would remain in service until the coast defences were disbanded in the 1950s. The first guns mounted at Inchkeith and Kinghorn were 10-inch muzzle loaders, already becoming obsolete in 1881, as the first breech-loading 6-inch gun was adopted by the Royal Navy in the same year. 4 guns covered the North Channel, that is the main channel into the river, between Inchkeith and Kinghorn, and 2 covered the South Channel, the shallower route to Leith Roads and Leith Docks. The inadequacy of the defences was acknowledged by the end of the 1880s, and they were strengthened during the following decade as part of a nationwide upgrading of coast batteries. The replacement of the 10-inch guns on Inchkeith with modern 9.2-inch and 6-inch breech-loading guns began in 1893 and was completed in 1903, the same year in which the last 10-inch muzzle-loading guns in the Forth at Kinghorn were replaced. Now, one of the many misunderstandings about the defences is that their primary role was to protect Rosyth Dockyard and the Forth Bridge. And while these were indeed defended as potential targets for enemy bombardment, the defences were designed primarily to protect the expanse of open water inside the defences, the naval anchorage, and the valuable ships moored there. This is a chart of the warship moorings in the upper estuary in 1913, showing how densely packed the moored ships were. And as you will see later, this was only the beginning. The guns, of course, were not the only form of defence, even in the late 19th century. Between 1880 and 1903, submarine mining was a key weapon in the Forth. Operators on shore, observing an enemy ship enter what was called the controlled minefield, could remotely detonate one or more groups of mines to destroy the attacking vessel. And such minefields were initially used and put in place to control the channels at Inchkeith. Controlled mining was reintroduced in 1915 and used until the end of the Second World War, but more about that later. Smaller guns were needed to stop enemy steamers clearing the controlled minefields out of the way, and 4.7-inch breech-loading, quick-firing guns were mounted at both Kinghorn and Inchkeith in the 1880s. That's the type of gun shown here. The only line of defence was at Inchkeith until the turn of the century, when an inner line was established just below the rail bridge, and that's what's shown on this map. A controlled minefield, the blue hatch, and a contact minefield, the red hatch, was established, protected by batteries of guns, which are labelled on the map from south to north as Dalmeny, Inchgarvie, Coastguard, and Carlingnose. Coast defences of any kind have to be redesigned to deal with new threats, such as faster and more heavily armoured ships, more powerful guns, fast torpedo boats, and finally submarines. Re-equipping coast defences was very expensive, and the purely defensive coastal artillery was always seen as less attractive for funding than the more active and aggressive parts of the armed forces. Shortage of funding meant that new batteries or guns might only be put in place a decade after they'd been planned, and by then yet further new developments might have made the original proposals obsolete. In the Forth, construction programmes planned in 1 year might not be completed until 4, 5, 10, or even 15 years later. In the first years of the 20th century, the British fleet was becoming so large that, to put it crudely, it was running out of places to park its ships, and too big to maintain using the existing dockyards in southern Britain. In 1903, therefore, the Forth was chosen as the site of a new naval base at Rosyth, capable of housing and maintaining a fleet in the North Sea against the growing threat of German naval expansion. Construction was not, however, begun until 1909. So this chart shows the arcs of fire of the various guns in the outer and inner defences between 1903 and 1905. The defences reached their pre-First War peak at this time, but not, as is widely stated and believed, as a result of the decision to build Rosyth. All the new batteries completed or upgraded at that time had been planned or begun before Rosyth was announced in 1903. After 1906, the defences were actually reduced. And this is not the place to describe in detail the struggle between the two predominant schools of defence current at that time. Suffice it to say that the Blue Water School, which believed that Britain needed nothing apart from a strong navy to defend the home country, was in the ascendant. The fleet, it was claimed, could prevent any major attack in the coast. Consequently, in 1905, the Owen Committee, which is a sort of beaching report for the coast defence system, recommended radical, indeed absurdly high reductions in coast artillery. It's difficult to, you can just see the density of the rings showing the number of guns actually covering the water. In the Forth, most of the medium 6-inch and light 12-pounder guns were removed, leaving only 8 guns to defend the estuary. It's the weakest it had ever been. By the autumn of 1907, the Admiralty realised that the lighter guns at the Forth Bridge, up here, were necessary to protect the anchorage from fast torpedo boats, and the lighter guns of the inner defences were reinstated. And in 1913, the reality of the threat posed by submarines was finally demonstrated to the Admiralty's satisfaction, when a submarine travelled submerged from Dundee past all the defences of the Firth of Forth to the construction site of the dockyard at Rosyth and the naval anchorage off it at St Margaret's Hope, and then returned to base without having been detected. Before that date, the Admiralty hadn't really taken submarines as a serious threat. Henceforth, the defences would have to take account of this new weapon. At the outbreak of the First World War, the defences of the river were much as they had been in 1907, although work was already underway to add 2 new heavy guns at Brayfoot. It's there. Inchgarvie was being converted to take more heavy guns. and there were new batteries being built at Downing Point and Hound Point, which are clearly marked there. When it became clear that the war was not going to be over by Christmas 1914, the first serious steps were taken to protect the anchorage in the Forth, including the need to provide additional moorings downstream from the bridge. That is in this area here. This map shows the situation once all the batteries had been completed or upgraded and the anti-submarine defences, either floated nets or nets on dolphins, which are piles driven into the bottom of the river, had been built. Anti-submarine nets were placed beneath the two spans of the Forth Bridge to protect the main anchorage west of the bridge. And at the same time, a new defence line was established across the river using the islands here, armed with guns, to protect the new anti-submarine defences. The defences comprised a complex of nets and booms to prevent submarines from passing upriver, and in front of it, marked by the blue lines, were controlled minefields which could be exploded from observation positions on the islands. Now, during the first half of the war, the Forth was the base only of the Grand Fleet's battlecruiser squadron, as well as being the main port of the British minesweepers working in the North Sea. But in early 1916, this shows the extension of the moorings out towards Inchcolm in 1915. In early 1916, it was decided that the main body of the Grand Fleet would move its operational anchorage from Scapa Flow in Orkney to the Firth of Forth, as it would be closer to the likely areas of operation of the German High Seas Fleet, particularly if the Germans repeated their 1914 raids on towns on the English coast, as indeed they did in February 1916, and the victims of those bombardments are marked with yellow marks there. As a consequence of the move, if you remember back to the 1907 map, when there was the odd circle, this map is incomprehensible because there are so many guns covering the water. This is how the defences were strengthened. For over a year from April 1916, the batteries were the scene of a colossal effort, as the relatively simple batteries of the middle defences, that's those at Inchcolm and the other islands, were completely rebuilt as far more complex permanent structures. There was a general shift of the heavier guns in the river further east, downriver, and the lighter guns westwards towards the bridge. New batteries were built at Leith Docks and at Pettycur, adjacent to the Kinghorn Battery. A more extensive series of obstructions was also built to prevent submarines reaching the anchorage, including a barrier between Granton and Black Rock at Burnt Island, behind which yet more moorings could be placed, this time for the auxiliary ships of the fleet. I haven't actually counted the total number of moorings in the river at this point, but you can see just how densely packed it would be with ships. These photographs show parts of the boom built onto the bottom of the estuary, running out towards Inchkeith, and here this is Drum Sands, and a floating section of net in the deeper part of the river. Gates were provided for ships to pass safely through, and the opening and closing of these gates was operated by trawlers like this one in the painting of the Granton Gate in the Blackrock boom by Charles Pears. Hydrophones were placed in 4 lines at the mouth of the estuary here to listen for the sounds of submerged submarines. And there were also anti-submarine nets here. The so-called Fidra Gap, which was actually open to allow ships to pass most of the time, could be closed temporarily using nets towed by trawlers to provide a safe area westwards here for the fleet to exercise. After the armistice in 1918, the defences were run down quickly, and between the First and Second World Wars, the strategic centre of gravity moved away from the North Sea, where there was seen to be little threat from defeated Germany and the Soviet Union in chaos. In the 1920s, war planning was actually directed against a potential threat from France, with its immense bomber fleet, and the Committee of Imperial Defence, not for the first time, vetoed the construction of a Channel tunnel. Largo Bay, here, was identified, however, as as a major convoy mustering and unloading point in any future war, and that was a role it served in the Second World War. Coast defence in general stagnated between the wars with no funding and no developments to guns really to speak of. In the Forth, the defences of the middle line on the islands of Inchcolm, Inchmickery and Cramond had been dismantled by 1931, and it was not until 1938, as the international situation began to deteriorate, that planning began to reinstate the defences. The last battery of the inner defences, the Coast Guard battery at the Forth Bridge, was disarmed at this time, and from now on, the innermost defences would lie across the river between Cramond Island, Inchmickery, Inchkeith, and the Fife mainland. This included building the concrete anti-boat barrier between Cramond Island and the mainland, which anybody who's visited the island will be familiar with. Late in the First World War, a method had been developed to detect steel vessels, including submerged submarines, passing over a cable on the seabed. And one of the first of these guard loops, as they were called, deployed in conjunction with controlled mines, sank a U-boat trying to enter Scapa Flow in 1918. By 1939, the technology had matured, and guard loops to detect vessels and mine loops, that is a combination of controlled mines within detector loops as here, were laid in the Forth between 1937 and 1939. There was an outer complex of 12 guard loops at the Isle of May to provide early warning of a submarine, and naval patrol vessels would investigate any alarms. And new batteries were built at Kincraig here and near Durlton, which was called the Fidra battery. At the latter, the guns were camouflaged as using canvas as cottages. This was done also at the battery at Berwick. The Kincraig battery, which not on this map, was the only, which it protected the convoy anchorage in Largo Bay, was provided with the only modern 6-inch guns in the river, and was also the only one to be provided with gun control radar in 1943. The strongest defences were concentrated upriver at Inchkeith and at Inchcolm. A series of guard and mine loops, these are the guard loops, to detect a submarine coming upriver. There's an anti-submarine boom here, and controlled minefields to catch anything that triggered an alert on the loops. The defences absorbed large numbers of personnel. Inchkeith in the Second War had a garrison of over 1,100 at its peak, and you can see how crowded the island is with buildings in this map. And included a dozen women of the ATS who travelled out from Leith every day on a boat to the island to do the typing. Unlike in South Africa, where they were actually controlling the guns. The men were just doing all the heavy lifting. The women were actually giving the firing orders. What was now the inner line of defence across the river at Inchcolm comprised an anti-boat boom and anti-submarine and anti-torpedo nets. Visible on this aerial photograph of Inchcolm, the Charles Hill battery here in Fife, and various different levels of net and defence visible. The inner line was guarded by a mixture of 12-pounder guns, which actually dated from the 1890s, but were still very perfectly efficient, and specially designed fast-firing 6-pounder guns with a twin barrel to tackle motor torpedo boats. This was really the only new development in coast artillery between the wars, and it was very successful, because although the 6-pounders in the Forth were never fired in anger, in Malta on the 26th of July 1941, guns of the same type sank 9 Italian E-boats in 2 minutes. So it's quite good if you like that sort of thing. The coast artillery was run down at the end of the war and finally made obsolete by more modern weapons and closed in the 1950s. In the Forth, however, exercises took place in the 1960s to practice the skills necessary to establish an anti-submarine boom in the Forth. And it was only in 1977 that the Ministry of Defence wrote to Historic Scotland's predecessors to say that they were giving up the 2 boom anchors on Inchcombe, which are still preserved on the island. The privatisation of the Royal Dockyard in 1997 and the subsequent slow decline of the naval presence in the Forth, due to end finally in 2022, I believe, marks the end of a century in which the Forth played a key part in Britain's naval defence. Much survives of the defences, and many sites are accessible, although many are also very dangerous places. The surviving remains offer an opportunity, which we hope will be taken up, to tell the story of the defence of the Forth. In the inner defences, the Dalmeny Battery, having been carefully and lovingly restored by its current owner, is to become the Forth Bridge Visitor Centre. Network Rail assure us that their plans include preservation and interpretation of the battery, so that's very positive. The First World War Downing Point Battery in Fife is now in the hands of a very local and enthusiastic local management group who have done a great deal to clear and conserve the site and have plans for its interpretation. Once again, a tremendous opportunity is going to be taken. Hound Point on the south coast, near South Queensferry, is accessible to the walker, albeit with care, as is the impressive 9.2-inch battery at Bray Food. On the middle line, the Cramond Island defences of the Second War are accessible to visitors at low tide, and Charles Hill in Fife is accessible on foot with care and is in good condition after the intervention of the Fife Council Archaeology Service, who stopped stuff being dumped on it. Inchmickery, although impressive, is not safely accessible, and I only show this slide to stress that no, it was not designed to look like a ship. And if I hear somebody say that to me again, of course you know it was, I'll tell them it wasn't. Not the slightest evidence. Inchcombe, where part of the island is in the care of Historic Environment Scotland and the rest of the island leased to them, offers perhaps the greatest opportunity to display defence structures of both wars, including a uniquely surviving wooden hut and metal fittings in the searchlight housings. Everywhere else they've been stripped out for scrap. And I'm glad to say that Ron and I are working with Historic Environment Scotland to expand the information made available to visitors. In the outer defences, Inchkeith is really too dangerous to visit. It's a death trap. The Leith Docks Battery was swept away long ago, and Kinghorn is now reduced to the survival of fragments, including a loopholed wall for defence and a searchlight housing. This is the only one with any off Inchcombe with any metal surviving, and it's the entire shutter system at the front, which is a unique survival in Scotland, I think. The battery at Kincraig near Ely survives well on the coastal path with its unique radar buildings, and some fragments also survive of the occupation of the Isle of May, to which access is made available by SNH. Our time is up. Ron and I hope that we've given you a taste of the richness and significance of these monuments to the history of the river and the defence of Britain, and we hope that our research will aid the conservation and interpretation of what remains. Thank you very much.